I could have listened to that for another 20 minutes myself. Uh, Bob has heard me say this before. It's very intimidating for me to speak when Bob Solo's in the audience, because when I was a reporter at the Boston Globe and the Nobel Prize was awarded to Bob Solo, I covered his press conference. And it was a room about the size of this. And Bob looked out at all the reporters and all the cameras, took a deep sigh, and said, "The problem we have here is that the average length of a true sentence is longer than the attention span of your readers and viewers." So I'm going to speak in very short sentences. I wrote a book about the federal budget for this reason. The publishers at Random House, the people who edit business books, said to me, "You know, David, the Fed was boring. You made the Fed interesting. The budget's boring. Couldn't you make the budget interesting?" And I said to them, you know, making the Federal Reserve interesting as Ben Bernanke stared into an abyss the size of the Great Depression didn't take a great amount of narrative skill. But the budget, nothing's happening. And they said, well, what if you did, and they painted me this picture of how they thought the budget worked. The president and his advisors sit and make choices about priorities, and then they send the budget to Congress, and Congress deliberates, and then Congress makes decisions, and then the spending comes out the other way according to these priorities. And I'm sitting there listening to this description of the federal budget process that resembled the diagrams in a fourth grade textbook. And I said to them, at first I thought, if this is the people who edit business books in Random House, they're probably smarter than the median reader out there. Maybe I do have some work to do. And I brought with me some charts made by Pete Peterson's foundation. Pete Peterson is a billionaire who literally given $1 billion to set up a foundation to try and raise public awareness about the deficit. I'm not sure he's actually made any impact on public awareness about the deficit, but he's hired some really good graphic artists. So I brought these charts, and I started going through the facts of the budget. And with each one, their jaw dropped. And so that's when I decided that, basically, if you guys want to pay me to write a book about something that I already know, because I've been writing about the budget for 20 years, I'm happy to do it. And then I realized that there was actually, I think, some value in it. This is a short book, as Bob said. It's 35,000 words, 150 pages. I like to think of it as a book for people who kind of know the federal budget and the deficit are important, but have never read to the end of a single Wall Street Journal story on the subject. And I've kind of learned, I tried really hard to boil this down to a few points because I actually don't think it's all that complicated. And one of the main points I want to make, and it's relevant to some of the stuff that Leibovich said on this platform a few minutes ago, is that there are choices we have to make about the federal budget. There are choices we have to make about how big a government we want to have, how rich a safety net. There are choices we have to make about how much our tax system should serve to narrow the gap between winners and losers in our economy. And those are very important choices in the best sense of the word, which are political, that need to be made in a democracy by our elected representatives. But there are also a set of facts about the budget. And too often, I think, in journalism today, those two things are melded together. So if you watch Fox News, I don't know if do they even get Fox News on Martha's Vineyard? Probably. If you did get Fox News on Martha's Vineyard, you would get one set of conclusions about the budget and a set of facts that support it. If you watched MSNBC, you get another set of conclusions about the budget and a set of facts that support those. If you're one of the 13 people in America who watch both MSNBC and Fox, you're probably very confused. So my basic point here is that we can't make informed decisions unless we have some choices. I'm a journalist. I ought to be able to explain the budget to you in a book that you can read in one sitting or two. And that's what I set out to do. Now, I want to say at the beginning that the federal deficit today is not our most pressing economic problem. Our most pressing economic problem today is that still, 4 years after 4 years of economic growth, we have 7.4% unemployment. We have something like 11.5 million people who are not working and looking for work. Over 4 million of them have been out of work for 6 months or more and are still looking for work. About 3 million people have been out of work for a whole year or more and still tell the census takers that they're still looking for work. That is our most pressing economic problem. The deficit is tomorrow's problem, and I personally think it's possible for us to deal both with today's problem and tomorrow's. My book is really about tomorrow's problem, and my premise is that you don't need to have taken too many of Bob Solo's courses at MIT, although it would help to understand the budget, that you can really, as a citizen, understand this by understanding a few facts. One fact is that 2/3 of the federal budget is on autopilot. The money goes out the year without an affirmative vote of Congress. It's not illegal, it's not unconstitutional. It's basically money that's spent to make good on promises that have been made in the past. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, farm price supports, and of course interest on the federal debt. Congress, of course, spends almost all its time arguing about the other third of the budget. Just this week in Congress, the week as before they left on summer vacation, they're having a huge blow-up about one of the federal appropriations bills, affectionately known to insiders as THUD, Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development, THUD. And they were unable to come to consensus for a variety of reasons. But there was no discussion about Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, taxes, or interest on the federal debt. They spend most of their time arguing about this third of the budget, which is annually appropriated. This is kind of an accident of history, but it's a fundamental problem because they never have to confront the decisions that are pretty big about about intergenerational equity and about, of course, what's really driving the deficit, which isn't the THUD bill or any of the other appropriations bills. The second fact is that within that 2/3, the thing that's driving federal spending and the thing that's driving the deficit is largely health care costs. In 1960, before Medicare and Medicaid came along, about 10% of federal spending went to health care. Today, it's about 25%. The Congressional Budget Office says at the end of the decade, even though there's been some slowing of the growth of health care costs, it'll be about 30% of all federal spending. Now, some of this is deliberate. We have decided that the government should provide health insurance for more people. And some of it is not deliberate. We have ended up with the world's most expensive health care system. We spend far more per person on health care than any other country on the planet, and we don't have the world's healthiest population. And unless we can find a way to find a better way to deliver quality health care, we're going to literally we're going to crowd out spending on other things. The third fact you need to know is that the federal government employs a lot of people. No doubt about that. The federal government spends about $450 billion a year on salaries and benefits for its employees, and that's a lot of money. But if we had no federal employees, no Barack Obama social secretary, no Barack Obama Secret Service agent, no lady at Yellowstone collecting the tolls, nobody manning the missile defense silo somewhere in Alaska, fire all of them, we would have cut the deficit in half. We still would have a huge deficit last year, even if we fired every federal employee. And the reason is because most of the money the government gets, it sends out again in the form of benefits or contracts or grants to state and local government. One of my concerns about the debate over the budget in the last presidential election is that Mitt Romney, and to some extent Barack Obama as well, made it seem as if somehow we can control the deficit, but none of you will have to get less benefits or pay more taxes. It's always somebody else who's going to have to pay more taxes or somebody else whose spending is going to be squeezed. Well, the sad truth is that isn't true. If we want the federal government to have a smaller deficit, somebody's going to have to pay more taxes and somebody's going to get less in benefits that have been promised by current law. That's simple arithmetic. That's not an opinion, that's simple arithmetic. The fourth thing you need to know about the federal budget is we spend a hell of a lot of money on defense in this country. We spend more money on defense than the next 17 countries' defense budgets combined. I can't memorize 17 countries, so we spend more money on defense than China, plus the UK, plus France, plus Russia, Japan, Saudi Arabia, Germany, India, Brazil, South Korea, Australia, Canada, Turkey, the UAE, Spain, Israel, and Turkey. More than all those countries combined. Now, I believe we need a strong defense. I think we have to worry about missiles from North Korea. I think we have to worry about hacking from China. But we're going to have to make some decisions about how much defense is enough How much can we afford? And do we really need to have a military where the Navy, the Air Force, the Marines, and the Army each have to have their own expensive brand of stapler? In the book, I talk about some of the other choices that we have to make, how many aircraft carriers are enough, but you can't make decisions about the federal spending without thinking something about how much we spend on defense. And of course, the other thing, it's not all about spending, some of it's about taxes. And there's lots of controversy about taxes, and there's lots of political choices to make about taxes, but two things are worth keeping in mind. One is, if you add up all the exemptions, credits, deductions, and loopholes in the tax code, you know the difference between a loophole and a credit. If I get it, it's a credit. If you get it, it's a loophole. If you add them all up, they add up to almost as much foregone revenue as we collect from the individual income tax. About $1 trillion of taxes we collect, and another $1 trillion we forego for all these loopholes, deductions, credits, and exclusions. And there is some sense in Washington that this has gotten out of control, and we ought to do something about that. And they're not too good on the details, but on that one thing, they're pretty good. And the other thing is that taxes for the most of the people in the United States have not gone up over the last 30 years. Federal taxes as a share of income were about 18% of income, all federal taxes, Social Security, income, and all that. In 1979, they came down a little. They went up a lot as the economy got better. And before the recession, they were about 14% of income. For people who live in the middle 20% of the income distribution, the middle of the middle class, the share of income they pay in taxes to the federal government has come down. Very few of them accept that as a fact, but it's true. All right, so how has the federal government managed to spend all this money if they were taxing the middle of the middle class less? Well, it's pretty simple, two ways. One way is they taxed the rich more, partly because the rich had more income, so they paid a greater share of taxes, and partly because perennially we raise taxes on the rich, we lower it, then we raise it again. So that's one way. But the second thing is we borrowed a lot. Last year, the federal government borrowed 34 cents for every dollar it spent. 34 cents for every dollar it spent. Now, it turns out that we are extraordinarily lucky. We live in a country that the rest of the world wants to lend money to. So even though we have a federal government that seems to have in many ways lost the trust of the American people, even though we have an unsustainable federal budget business model, the rest of the world continues to lend the U.S. Treasury money so readily that interest rates are lower than they've been in generations. Now you have to ask yourself, why is that? So think of the Chinese. They have $2 trillion, I can't remember what it is, of money. They have to decide to put it somewhere. I don't think that they're lending it to the United States because it's a great vote of confidence in the United States. What alternatives do they have? Well, they could put it in Japan, but Japan has been, until recently, a declining economy. It's a shrinking population, and right now it seems to be embarked on a policy of cheapening its currency, so it doesn't seem like a very good long-run bet. They could put it in Europe, but Europe can't even agree if it wants to have a currency anymore. I mean, the one thing you can say about the United States is there's very little controversy about, well, we will all continue to share the dollar. I mean, there's some people in Texas who are trying to secede every once in a while, but other than them, there's this confidence. So people are lending money to us and have during this wrenching, devastating recession because we were the least bad alternative. The United States is the world's tallest midget. If we could count on that going on forever, we would be on a sustainable course. So I've thought a lot about how do you explain to people why it is that this can't go on forever? I mean, after all, as I said, unemployment is our big problem, and we're borrowing money at rock bottom interest rates, often less than the rate of inflation. So why can't this go on forever? Well, here's one way to think about it. Today, even though interest rates are very low, the federal government spends 6% of its budget on interest. That's more than the budgets of the Departments of Commerce, Education, Energy, Homeland Security, Justice, State, Transportation combined, plus the budget of the courts and the legislature. So that's a pretty big chunk of the federal budget at rock bottom interest rates. The president's budget says that if everything goes well, and president's budgets always promise that in a few years the economy will be wonderful, and if Congress took every single suggestion that he made for spending and taxes, which you know they won't, it will be 10% of federal spending 5 years from now. We are at risk of having a government that is basically a health and retirement system for old people, some missiles, airplanes, and drones, and interest on the federal debt. Everything else will get squeezed out. In that everything else is absolutely everything that will make life better for our kids and grandchildren. Every broadband connection, every aid to education, every highway, every NIH grant, all those things are being squeezed because our political system has been unable to set some priorities and deal with the twin problems of how do we get more revenue and where do we get it from, and which benefits do we want to slow the growth of, and how do we do that in such a way that we can still keep our values. And so what I'm trying to, I've given up trying to change the way the press reports the budget. There's someone here who was talking about that at a panel yesterday. All I think any one reporter can do is to say, it's not that complicated. You can understand it. If you took the 5 points I gave you, you know enough to make decisions about the federal budget. The details are important, but they're not that important. And if we don't do something about this, and if not now, when, we are basically screwing the next generation and the generation after that. Those are facts. Now you can choose what to do with it. I'm going to stop there, and I'm happy to take questions about this, or what's it like to work for Rupert Murdoch anyways, or anything else. He's at the microphone.
So thank you. There were two things in what you said that I found perplexing.
Just two, huh?
Yeah, well, two in the way that you were phrasing things, and I think the way we frame things is important, and the way we understand and think about and understand things. You said about healthcare, you say if we can figure it out. I don't think it's a big mystery. I think people have figured it out, and in Germany they figured it out. In Japan they figured it out. In most places in the world they figured it out. I don't think it's a mystery. It's the political system that is blocking the solution that I think is widely shared by many Americans, which is some form of single-payer insurance, not government-run healthcare. That's number one. Number two, whenever there's a book about the budget, and I appreciate your work and most of what you've said, I always look in the index and I look for the word military. And the index in your book, under military, it says see defense. And our military is not about defense. And so I would like to ask you to speak to the question of, are we not now at the point where we can say, not use the word defense anymore for the massive military in 119 different countries of the world? And do we not have solutions to the healthcare problem, and it's just the political system that won't allow us to go there?
I don't believe that the political system is the only problem that we have in solving the vexing problem of healthcare costs. There's a reason that the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, isn't a single-payer system. Because basically a majority of the American people won't vote for members of Congress who advocate single-payer. We have a kind of incredible ambivalence and sometimes hypocritical view about healthcare. We have an appetite for healthcare in this country that exceeds those of other countries, and we have an unwillingness, a kind of gut feeling that if you want healthcare, you should get it. Two examples. I was in New York recently, and there was some big sign about 1-800-CAT scan, where you can get a CAT scan even if your insurance doesn't pay for it if you want it. And the second is this awful experience we had, fueled by a bunch of demagogues to be sure, when in the discussion of the Affordable Care Act, there was that should your doctor be able to get reimbursed if he or she has a conversation with you about your end-of-life wishes? And this became death panels, and it became toxic, and we can't discuss it. So our ambivalence about controlling healthcare costs, I think, extends beyond the political system. Look, I take your point about military and defense and how we frame things is important, but I believe, and most Americans believe, we need a strong defense. And the question is, how much money do we have to spend to have a strong defense? And then why are we spending the stuff that isn't for our defense? In the book, I talk about how many aircraft carriers we need. But I think to suggest that somehow we don't need a defense or the American public won't support one is kind of naive. Sir.
David, I read your book early on because I read all these things being involved in finance for years.
God bless you.
Yeah. What? The ink was barely dry and I'd already finished it and everybody else. But I am fascinated and frustrated by the young people, our children. I have 3 daughters. And what burden we're putting on them. And we had a couple young men that took the semester off from Harvard and came down to our house in Virginia to live for a couple of months to work on a political campaign. So I actually had, after 3 daughters, I had 2 adopted sons. And we had some interesting conversations, obviously with these 2 21-year-olds. And I said to one, Michael, I said, it's really unfair what our generation's doing to your generation, putting the financial burdens on you. You're going to have to be paying 60 and 70% marginal tax rates to be able to care for us, and that's just wrong. To which he said, well, when I'm working at Goldman Sachs making $1 million a year, I think I could live on $400,000. And I said, well, first of all, assuming there is a Goldman Sachs then, which is a big if, and secondly, you forgot state and local taxes, so you might be down to $250, and let me check with you later on if that actually happens and see how you feel at that time. But again, the concept is theoretical. You can't explain that to a 21-year-old. Maybe when they're 40, it'll be very clear.
So I think you're right. I think that one of the ironies in our political system is that when you have a discussion about changing the way Social Security and Medicare work, you're basically talking about changing it for our kids' generation. We're not talking about changing it for people even in my generation. I'm 59 years old, and all the candidates were falling all over each other to say, well, anything we do to Social Security and Medicare, it won't affect people who are 55 and over. So I think that's true. I don't think that's new. I think that it's always been difficult for the political system to operate on the interests of people who are in that age bracket. We seem to be willing to pay for their education, and then we do things that will affect them in the long run. I think you could say the same thing about climate change, that an inability to deal with climate change now is probably going to be more devastating to our kids and the kids that follow. I want to thank you for putting up those kids who are working on a campaign. My son is working on a campaign in New Jersey, living in someone else's bedroom, and so on his behalf, I thank you. But I do have to say that I've been struck by the number of kids who are working on political campaigns, partly started by the Obama thing. And these are a bunch of young people who give me a great deal of hope. Some of them are really, really committed to making the world better for themselves and the rest of us. And many of them are just incredibly impressive leaders and have learned how to organize things. And so when I get really depressed about, the nitwits we've elected to Congress, I look at all these kids who are running around working for Barack Obama or Terry McAuliffe or Cory Booker, and it gives me a little hope that maybe it's not so dark at the end of the tunnel.
I'm a retired physician. The thing that strikes me about the healthcare problem at this point is that the fees that are paid for any particular service do not necessarily reflect the economic value of the service.
Correct.
And the New York Times in particular has done a terrific job of demonstrating that over the last couple months, and including an article today. In the setting of a free market economy, theoretically, prices should reflect some sort of economic value. The current system doesn't allow for that. Any thoughts as to how to fix this?
Well, I'm not smart enough to have a solution to the healthcare system, but I think you've identified one of the problems. I mean, basically, you get what you pay for. And for a long time, the federal system of paying for healthcare, and the federal government pays for about 45% of healthcare, it paid for volume, not for quality. So it got a lot of volume and not a lot of quality. And a lot of what's embodied in the Affordable Care Act, as complicated and Rube Goldberg and misunderstood as it may be, is attempts to change that way of paying for things. But it turns out, A, it's really hard to change a big system. The healthcare system is huge in our country. And B, if you're in the business of getting paid for volume, you tend to be a little resistant to changing the way things work. And so we're engaged in, we'll find a better way to do that. There's a lot of smart minds doing it. It's going to be a lot of trial and error. I suspect it'll be some peculiarly American system that won't look like the German or the Swiss or the Japanese. But what we at least we have identified that as a problem. I think there's widespread consensus now in Washington that we can't afford to have the healthcare system that we have now for another 50 years, and that there's a better way to organize it. that would provide quality care and wouldn't be so expensive. There's a lot of disagreements about what's the best way to do that, but that's basically an argument worth having.
My question's about quantitative easing. Assuming that the Fed is buying $85 billion a month and they're buying one-year treasuries, they've been doing it for 3 years. Why are they spending $85 billion or $250 billion? Because they're going to have to repay the money that's due for the treasuries that they've already bought.
Well, what the gentleman's referring to is what the Federal Reserve is doing now. The Federal Reserve cut short-term interest rates to zero at the end of 2008. And short-term interest rates have been at zero for almost 5 years, and the Fed tells us they're going to be at zero for another couple of years. And so, as Bob mentioned, in what is now the new orthodoxy, the Fed decided, well, why stop there? So they're buying a lot of bonds in order to push down long-term interest rates. But they're not, in fact, buying one-year bonds. By design, they're buying bonds for most of them between 7, 10, and 15 years, because that's the whole point, is to push down long-term interest rates. Can this go on forever? No. But it's not clear to me that $3 trillion, which is what the Fed balance sheet is, it was $800 billion when Ben Bernanke took over. It's $3 trillion now. It's not clear to me that if it got to 3.5 or 4, that the world would end. And so you see the Fed beginning to think about slowing the pace at which it's buying bonds, even though unemployment remains high and inflation is non-existent. And there will be some dislocations. When you can't do this much manipulating of the economy without having some bad side effects. But the side effect you're suggesting is not one to worry about. They're buying long-term treasuries, and they hope that by the time they mature, that the economy will be back to normal.
So you hear people say that the countries that we owe money to will never call in their chips because then the whole system would fall apart. You know, we owe them, they owe us. It kind of sustains itself. I wonder if you could talk about that.
Right. Well, it is. I don't live in fear that one day the Chinese are going to decide to sell all their treasuries and tank our economy for the reason you suggest. First of all, we turn out to be their biggest market, and they're going to have a hard time employing their people if they can't sell stuff to us. And secondly, just like if you're, you know what they say, if you owe $100 to the bank, they own you. If you own $2 million to the bank, you owe them. The Chinese have a huge invested interest in keeping our economy from tanking. The question isn't so much, I think there are two respects in which we have to worry. One is, this does give them a little bit of leverage, and it's a little uncomfortable. If you read Hank Paulson's book, The Former Treasury Secretary, he talks about when they took over Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and they basically wiped out the shareholders and most of the preferred shareholders, but not the debt holders. And one reason they didn't wipe out the debt holders is because a large part of that debt was held by the Chinese. So the Treasury Secretary of the United States had less freedom to wipe out the bondholders at Fannie Mae than he did at Bear Stearns because they were the Chinese. So that's one thing. And secondly, if we continue to borrow money for them, more and more of our annual output will go to pay interest on the debt that they hold. And when I went to college, they told us, don't worry about the federal debt. We owe it to ourselves. The people on this side of the room save, and the people on this side of the room get the benefits. We owe it to ourselves. Well, we don't owe it to ourselves anymore. About half the federal debt is held by foreigners, and that means that some of our income every year goes to pay them interest. So I think the concern is less some cataclysm and more what Charlie Schultz, the economist who was one of the advisors to Jimmy Carter, once said is, it's a little bit like smoking one more cigarette. No one cigarette is going to kill you, but if you keep it up, it is going to kill you. Well, that's what this is. It's more chronic.
I'd like to comment on your point about where you indicated that you don't believe that the political process has all that much to do with the federal deficit. And by way of
well, that's not really what I said. What I said was that the political process is not the only reason we're having trouble dealing with health care. That's one of the reasons we're having dealing with health care is, as a society, we have some conflict about whether we really want to spend less on health care or get more health care.
Well, let me just comment on the point that
Okay.
the doctor made about the article in today's New York Times. I I do believe there are some very deep and serious perverse incentives that most people, frankly, are not aware of in our healthcare system, particularly with reference to the story today. There's a system in our country, in our healthcare system, involving hospital group purchasing organizations, in which the result from a piece of legislation back in 1987 called the Anti-Kickback Safe Harbor Exemption that allowed vendors to pay kickbacks to these purchasing groups that are responsible for purchasing $250 billion in supplies for 5,000 American hospitals. And there was a study a couple of years ago that showed that this system, using actual transaction data, had inflated the cost of healthcare by at least 30 billion. That's billion with a B, every year. And Congress, this whole system has become so institutionalized, and you've got so many members of Congress that have that get so much money from these GPOs and hospital executives that feed off of them, that this whole system is completely taken over a big chunk of our healthcare dollar. So there are issues, there are pieces of the system that could easily be remedied if the political will was there to do so.
I don't know anything about group purchasing in hospitals, but there's nothing you said I disagree with.
Hi. My question has to do with the fact that I worry about the future too. And one of the things I worry about the most is the unemployment rate and the fact that the number of jobs in this country is going down. Wages have been stagnant. And why this isn't as high an imperative for us to make the future better than dealing with the deficit.
So, well, as I think I said, I think this is our chief problem. It's not true that the number of jobs is going down. The number of jobs is going up. It's just not going up fast enough. Wages have been stagnant. And I'm not arguing that we shouldn't worry about that. I think we should. There are people who say, why worry about the deficit now? We should only worry about this short-term unemployment problem. And I have some sympathy for that view, but I have two reservations about it. One is the trouble with not worrying about long-term problems is that they become short-term problems. When I came to Washington in 1987, everybody said we have to fix Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security before the baby boom retires. Well, the baby boom is now retiring. 10,000 people a day turn 65. So it is a good thing to worry about long-term problems before they become crises. But the second thing is a political point, and I think you can see this in what the president is doing. There are a lot of people in America, and a large number in Congress, who don't believe that the federal government's stimulus helped reduce unemployment. And I think they're wrong, but the only way I think we're going to get more juice for the economy to deal with the short term is to package it in a broader piece of legislation that does something about the long term. So the president, for instance, often talks about embedding spending on infrastructure in a broader long-term budget thing, and I think that doesn't. It's hardly a sure thing, but that is the most likely way to get more short-term help from the economy, is to embody it in a long-term solution that then you can get this coalition to get it through.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Terrific.